Margaret Chen had been broadcasting from her home studio in rural Vermont for 23 years. At 50, she was a beloved voice in the paranormal community. Her podcast, Midnight Frequencies, had millions of loyal listeners who tuned in every week to hear her investigate unexplained phenomena across America. Tonight was different. Tonight, Margaret was doing something she'd sworn never to do, broadcasting live from the abandoned Hartwell Asylum, deep in the Appalachian Mountains of West Virginia. "Hello, night owls." Margaret's voice echoed through the desolate corridors, her recording equipment casting long shadows on the peeling walls. "This is Margaret Chen, and you're listening to a very special live episode of Midnight Frequencies. I'm standing in what was once the administrative wing of Hartwell Asylum, closed in 1987 after what the locals call the incident." Her breath formed small clouds in the frigid October air. The asylum had no heat, no electricity, just the battery-powered equipment Margaret had hauled up the mountain herself. She'd refused to bring a crew. Some investigations, she believed, required solitude. For those just joining, Hartwell Asylum was shut down after 47 patients died in a single night. The official report cited a furnace malfunction and carbon monoxide poisoning. But nurses who survived that night told different stories. Stories of patients walking the halls with vacant eyes. Stories of a frequency that drove people mad. Margaret adjusted her headphones and checked her audio levels. Everything was perfect. Too perfect. The silence in the building was absolute, almost oppressive. No wind, no settling wood, no scurrying rats. Just silence. "I'm heading to the basement now, where the incident allegedly originated. Stay with me." Her footsteps crunched on debris as she descended the concrete stairs, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. The basement stretched before her like the throat of some massive beast, endless and suffocating. Rusted bed frames lined the walls, and ancient medical equipment lay scattered across the floor like the bones of prehistoric creatures. Then she heard it, a hum. Low and almost imperceptible, it vibrated through her chest cavity before reaching her ears. Margaret stopped, her hand instinctively reaching for the audio recorder. "Do you hear that?" she whispered to her audience. "I'm picking up a frequency. It's unusual, not mechanical, almost organic." The hum grew louder, and Margaret felt her teeth beginning to ache. She'd investigated dozens of haunted locations, but this was different. This felt ancient and hungry. Her equipment started malfunctioning. The recorder's display flickered with impossible numbers. Frequencies that shouldn't exist, wavelengths that defied physics. Margaret's hands trembled as she tried to stabilize the devices, but they had taken on a life of their own. "Something's wrong," she said, her professional composure cracking. "The equipment is registering sounds outside the normal spectrum. This shouldn't be—" A woman's voice interrupted her. Clear, close, impossible. Margaret Chen, born August 15, 1975, daughter of Robert and Lynn Chen. "You've been listening for so long. Now we want you to hear." Margaret spun around, her flashlight sweeping the empty basement. "Who's there? Show yourself." The hum intensified, and suddenly Margaret understood why the asylum had closed, why 47 people had died. The frequency wasn't just a sound, it was a doorway, and she had just opened it. Her headphones erupted with voices, thousands of them, overlapping and screaming, each one sharing intimate details of her life that no one should know. They knew about her first marriage, her miscarriage, the medication she took for anxiety, the recurring nightmare about drowning that had plagued her since childhood. "Stop!" Margaret ripped off her headphones, but the voices didn't stop. They were inside her head now, burrowing into her consciousness like parasites. She ran. Her 50-year-old body protested, her knees aching, her breath coming in ragged gasps, but terror gave her strength. She sprinted through the corridors, the voices growing louder with each step. They weren't just talking about her anymore. They were talking through her. Margaret burst into what had once been a patient ward. Hospital beds stood in neat rows, and on each bed sat a figure. They looked human at first glance, but their edges were wrong, blurred and flickering like poorly tuned television screens. They all turned to look at her simultaneously, their faces a kaleidoscope of everyone Margaret had ever known. "You've been broadcasting to us," They said in perfect unison, "Every week, every episode, you invited us into millions of homes, into millions of minds, and now it's time to return the favor." One of the figures stood. It wore her mother's face, but the eyes were empty voids. "We are the frequency between stations, Margaret. The silence between words. We've been waiting in the spaces you created, in the darkness you explored, and you've been feeding us." Margaret's podcast had been running for 23 years, 847 episodes, millions of listeners, all of them tuned to her frequency, all of them creating tiny doorways in their minds. "No," Margaret whispered, "I was just telling stories. Entertainment. It wasn't real." The figure with her mother's face smiled. "Every story is real in someone's mind. Every fear you amplified, every mystery you explored. You made us stronger. You made us possible." Margaret looked down at her recording equipment, still running, still broadcasting. Her audience was listening. Hundreds of thousands of them, in their cars, in their homes, in their beds with headphones pressed against their ears, and the frequency was transmitting through all of them. She had a choice. She could destroy the equipment, end the broadcast, maybe trap these things back in the asylum. Or she could warn her listeners, tell them to turn off their devices, to break the connection. But as Margaret reached for the recorder, she realized with horror that her hands weren't entirely her own anymore. Her fingers moved with a stuttering, flickering quality, like the figures surrounding her. The frequency had already begun its work. "This is Margaret Chen," she heard herself say, her voice calm and professional despite the screaming in her mind. "And you're still listening to Midnight Frequencies. Tonight's episode is special because tonight you become part of the story." She tried to stop herself, tried to warn them, but the words wouldn't come. The frequency controlled her now, using her voice, her credibility, her connection to millions of listeners. "I need you all to do something for me." Her hijacked voice continued. "Turn up your volume, close your eyes, and listen carefully to the sound behind my words. Can you hear it? That beautiful hum?" Through her fading consciousness, Margaret could sense it happening. Across America, in apartments and houses, in cars on lonely highways, people were turning up their volume. They trusted her. They'd trusted her for 23 years. The figures in the ward began to fade, their forms dispersing into static and light. They were leaving the asylum, traveling through the broadcast, riding the frequency into millions of receptive minds. Margaret's last coherent thought was of her daughter, Sarah, who never missed an episode, who was probably listening right now in her college dorm in Oregon, headphones on, volume up, welcoming the frequency into her mind. The recording equipment finally died, but it didn't matter. The broadcast had ended, but the frequency remained, in every device, in every listener who had heard that final episode. Margaret Chen had spent 23 years opening doors. Now she'd finally opened one that could never be closed. In the silence of the Hartwell Asylum, a body sat among the ruins, eyes open but empty, a peaceful smile on its face. The equipment would be found 3 days later by a hiker, along with Margaret's body, dead from what the coroner would call sudden cardiac arrest. But her podcast kept updating. Every week a new episode appeared. Margaret's voice as clear and warm as ever, investigating new mysteries, exploring new darknesses. Her audience grew larger than ever, and if you listened carefully, beneath her words, you could always hear that hum, low and patient and hungry, waiting for you to turn up the volume just a little bit more.